know that it's hard for that to happen, but there can still be a logic for BIMSTEC to function together, even without having a formal free trade area. We know, for example, that if there are shallow free trade agreements, as many, for example, in South Asia, we have a very shallow SAFTA, if it can even be called a free trade agreement. So a shallow agreement does not really get you very far. So what are the other options to free trade agreements that can actually deepen trade and economic exchange? And we know that, for example, there is a lot of potential in things like energy. So deepening connectivity you can say, as almost like a substitute for going into a free trade agreement would be one possible way forward. But I think what I'm looking forward to hearing from all the speakers today is also in the in a kind of post-COVID scenario, although we're still in it, and also further complicated by the global impact on commodities because of the Russian invasion. There are all kinds of things happening worldwide, and there are people even stalwarts questioning the global economic architecture. So there is a lot going on today in the world, and we will have time for your questions and to try to take stock of all that's going on. Right now, let me start off by inviting Rupa Chanda to kickstart this session by giving her our opening remarks on what we can see, what kind of opportunities are emerging in BIMSTEC. What does she see? So over to you, Rupa.
Thanks a lot, Sanjay, and very good evening to everybody. I am very thankful to SANEM, ASEAN India Center, other organizers for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts and observations on the topic of the session, which is challenges and opportunities for BIMSTEC post-COVID. I think first thing to note is that COVID-19 has really laid bare many vulnerabilities of countries and has brought to light many weaknesses in existing mechanisms, regional or international. For instance, if you look at it, it's exposed the lack of preparedness of national health systems around the world. It has highlighted vulnerabilities, created approaches like just-in-time inventory management and overdependence on a few supplier countries. It's highlighted the inadequacy of existing international and regional frameworks to address inequities in access to essential health products and in achieving more balanced development of production and research capacity in this area. It has also exposed the huge digital divide as well as high dependence on the informal sector and lack of social protection systems which prevent inclusive development. But if we look at it the other way, what's a challenge or a weakness can also be seen to be an opportunity. By transforming behavior, by accelerating the digitalization of economies, by raising questions about existing paradigms of production, trade, investment, technology transfer, I think COVID-19 has really given a fillip to finding new approaches to address development and integration challenges. And it's made countries much more aware of the need to do so in a manner that's resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. This also holds true for regional blocs such as BIMSTEC. By highlighting the interdependence of countries in terms of logistics and supply chains, trade investment flows, technology sharing, value chain linkages, and mobility, COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of cooperation in all spheres and at all levels if we are to address shared risks and vulnerabilities. I think BIMSTEC in many ways is well placed as a regional platform to seize these opportunities post-COVID, given the nature of the grouping, the purpose for which it was set up, and importantly, because of the impact the pandemic has had on its members, which has clearly highlighted the need for stronger regional cooperation initiatives among the member countries. Just to give a bit of a context, why is BIMSTEC well placed? Well, it was established to strengthen economic and physical connectivity in this region through trade, investment, and travel by leveraging geographic advantages and resource endowments. So it offers a platform for cooperation in trade and investment, infrastructure, transport, people-to-people connectivity, and has implications across a range of sectors: agriculture, energy, education, tourism, name it. So there's tremendous potential in this sub-region to unlock intra-regional trade and investment and to develop regional value chains by removing existing barriers, by implementing trade facilitation, improving connectivity, and enabling greater private sector cooperation. Now, let me come to the challenges that COVID-19 has highlighted. I spoke more broadly in the context of what globally COVID-19 has exposed. But basically, in the context of BIMSTEC countries too, it has created certain challenges, it has aggravated existing ones, and has highlighted the need to do more nationally and regionally. For instance, recovery-related fiscal stimulus has put governments under financial stress and has underscored the importance of trade and investment in the recovery process. Similarly, the dependence of BIMSTEC members on the informal labor market and the severe adverse impact of the pandemic on the MSME segment has highlighted the importance of inclusive growth and placing more emphasis on institutional support mechanisms, digital integration, trade facilitation, and supply chain resilience post the pandemic. Likewise, the glaring gaps among many member countries in health systems capacity in terms of vaccine distribution, infrastructure, manpower, and the link that we come to see between access to health products and services and trade policy and trade facilitation measures has made evident the importance of regional trade and investment integration in addressing social objectives such as health security and pandemic preparedness. The pandemic has also highlighted the need for investment in digital infrastructure and literacy, for improving data connectivity, putting in place stronger regulatory frameworks for the digital economy, and the importance of digital trade facilitation and integration. So the pandemic has really thrown up a spectrum of challenges and gaps, which BIMSTEC countries must address for both short and long-term recovery. At the same time, it's also provided direction in terms of some areas where cooperation and integration initiatives can be important going forward. Now, let me turn to the opportunities. There are several opportunity areas, but I've just chosen 3 to highlight where BIMSTEC members could focus. Sanjay, you had mentioned about energy, physical connectivity. I mean, these are issues that have been discussed for some time. Let me just highlight 3 specific areas that came to mind in light of the pandemic in particular. These, I believe, are areas which would not only help deepen integration in the region, but would also address some of the challenges and gaps that I just mentioned and aid recovery in both the short term and enable inclusive growth in the long run. The first area is health. COVID-19 has highlighted the need to strengthen the public health sector, to invest in health management, research, manpower development, and health infrastructure, if public health services are to be more effective. It has also highlighted the important role of telemedicine in addressing health challenges and overcoming resource limitations. Going forward, BIMSTEC countries can benefit from experience sharing in terms of their handling of the pandemic and lessons learned. They can cooperate in the development of human resources, such as training of frontline health specialists and building capacity of community health workers. There's much scope for cooperation in disease surveillance, public health interventions, and pandemic management. There's scope for cross-border investment in setting up health establishments and diagnostic facilities. There's also an opportunity to use the national capacity developed in telemedicine to scale telehealth in the BIMSTEC countries and across borders among the members. Another area for regional cooperation is access to health products through trade facilitation and reduction of barriers which currently impede access to products and participation of member countries in related value chains, or through the framing of MRAs, adoption of common standards and protocols for health products, through technology transfer in development of vaccines and other products, cooperation in logistics, related infrastructure, regulatory compliances and approvals, and more broadly through knowledge sharing and transfer. So that's just in a nutshell, a lot can be done in the health sector. A second area where new opportunities have been created is in the digital economy. BIMSTEC countries can explore ways to strengthen their regional partnership in digital connectivity and digital trade. This means addressing issues of digital skilling, digital infrastructure investment, regulatory frameworks for data sharing and transfers, and linking players to the market through digital integration. This will, of course, require coherence in digital strategies, policies, and standards among the countries. Such steps can help overcome barriers to digital inclusion, leverage emerging e-commerce opportunities, and aid the recovery process. The spin-offs in areas such as financial inclusion, education, and employment creation can be huge. A third area that I chose to highlight today is the focus on SMEs and their integration with markets through both physical and digital trade, investment, and participation in regional and global value chains. This cooperation would involve many things, such as ensuring access to and sharing of affordable technologies, developing sustainable production processes for these entities, best practice sharing, identification of products which have potential for value chains in the region, and connecting SMEs to lead firms and investments in the region. These are just 3 examples. There are many others. For instance, cooperation on the issue of environmental sustainability and production processes, along with related issues of transfer of technology, best practice sharing, climate smart trade, or in the area of entrepreneurship and startups, because this is becoming increasingly important as a source of employment and growth. And this would be very important in the area of innovation as well. But to put these cooperation initiatives into action, member countries will have to continue their efforts on connectivity and trade facilitation. So I really think that connectivity and trade facilitation are sort of the underpinning, initiatives that have to continue if any of these other issues have to be addressed. Without physical and digital connectivity, none of the trade and investment integration initiatives that I've highlighted in the context of health, MSMEs, or digital economy can really take off. Without streamlined logistics, expedited and adequate supply of vaccines is not possible across borders. Multimodal connectivity is needed for supply of vaccines within the region. Likewise, continued efforts on trade facilitation are needed, including simplification of customs procedures, institution of national single windows, greater coordination among regulatory authorities across countries, and digitalization of trade, or paperless trade as it's called, both within and across member countries. Trade facilitation measures in turn have to be accompanied by efficient and reliable transport connectivity. So the two have to go hand in hand and must be supported, of course, by domestic reforms. So there are new challenges, but also new opportunities and directions post-COVID. However, these opportunities can be realized only through sustained efforts in the ongoing existing areas. Finally, before concluding, let me also mention that the broader geopolitical landscape is important. COVID-19 has given an impetus to diversification of supply chains to mitigate risks and enhance resilience. So the question is, can BIMSTEC countries leverage the regional advantage and potential value chain linkages to emerge as such an alternative? Can they align their regional and national investment and trade policies to capitalize on the shift? Also, to the extent that there are overlaps in membership between BIMSTEC and other regional blocs, such as RCEP and ASEAN, though to a limited extent, are there opportunities to link to the larger regional market and harmonize with other groups? These are just some broad strategic issues that BIMSTEC members should keep in mind as they seize the new opportunities post-COVID. So in sum, the pandemic has revealed many weaknesses in the region, but it has also opened new focus areas and target segments where cooperation is possible. All of this must be underpinned by continued efforts in the areas of trade facilitation and seamless connectivity. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rupa, for setting us off and bringing up highlighting for us both the challenges, but also the emerging opportunities. And you also said about the connectivity and trade facilitation being the underpinning for all of these opportunities. And I couldn't agree more there with you. So we have now our second speaker for the day, my friend Ehsan Mansoor. Good to see you, Ehsan. And I look forward to hearing your always wise remarks and continue to remain engaged with you offline. So Ehsan, over to you.
Yes, Sanjay, thank you very much. And good to see you in good health. and in good spirit as well. Now, I will focus on this issue from two angles. One is from Bangladesh perspective and one from the regional perspective. Basically, what I would say that BIMSTEC to me seems like it came with a lot of expectation and a lot of hopes, but not much happened in reality on the ground. And the main challenge there, the issues that identified by Ms. Rupa Chada are very much, I agree, energy, physical connectivity, and maybe I can add to that health sector cooperation, education sector cooperation. All those things can become good starting points for this. But so far, we have very little to show on that, and somehow the geopolitics has come into play, and the Myanmar situation has become a major roadblock for this initiative and the connectivity. A lot of the issues that we like to be addressed got stuck there. How do you overcome that? I don't know, because it's physically in the middle, and it's a barrier that and it's getting more into a difficult political, social, and geopolitical quagmire in Myanmar that I don't see any closure to that, like in the Ukraine issue. Ukraine is a new issue, but Myanmar issue is older. So we have that challenge, and unless we somehow overcome that, it's a problem. Also, I feel that there is a kind of regional geopolitics issue between China and India that is also not helping the situation. We initially talked of BCIM initiative, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, which covers a lot of countries within the BIMSTEC. That didn't go very far because of not getting the support of blessings from India, and so this to me is a major problem on that front. And whether anything going to change in the post pandemic period, I don't know. I frankly think that between India and Bangladesh, we can do a lot in terms of cooperation in all those areas, and that those things are happening. And they are, I mean, physical connectivity between Bangladesh and India has improved and can improve much further in terms of railway connectivity, in terms of road connectivity, in terms of land ports, in terms of air connectivity and rail connectivity, and all those are moving good. And we are also getting into the goods train coming from India. That's on a trial basis now, but those should accelerate. At least for this part, can integrate faster and better and more efficiently. We can achieve a lot, and then we have to wait for the geopolitical situation to be settled or sorted out. We cannot see that pandemic has a post-pandemic period can bring us any different geopolitics than so that stumbling block is still there. We can do a lot on energy front between India and Bangladesh. We have done some. That's limited. I think we can, as part of the regional grid for power distribution, we can have much more extensive power distribution between India and Bangladesh and Nepal and all those regional countries. Regional generation can also be thought of, because in India, as well as in surrounding countries, Nepal, Bhutan, we have a lot of hydropower and all that. We can have those proper joint venture investments, long-term investments, and make countries dependent on each other and create an ecology for trade investment in power sector in particular. ecosystem we need to develop there, and industries they will then follow. We have not yet engaged the private sector in any of these cross-border power trade or electricity trade. That's an area that we should think of more. I'm not at this point. I'm not talking about Thailand, because without Myanmar problem, we just can't link up with Thailand at this point. So I'm just focusing on this part alone. Health sector development is one area where perhaps we can cross over Myanmar and have good interaction and see whether there is scope for health sector development with cooperation among the regional countries. Myanmar, I mean, BIMSTEC countries with or without Myanmar. And we have seen it, how poorly prepared was the public sector health system in all of these countries, particularly India and Bangladesh. And it demonstrates that we all need a lot of investment in our public sector health infrastructure in future, so that we can overcome similar shocks much better than what we have done. Certainly, in the vaccine area, the cooperation worked quite well. Thankfully, India had the vaccine production system, which initially went very well for us, worked very well for us. Then, because of India's own problem, of course, we had some hiccups. But after that, things became normal as India's situation improved. We also got access again to Indian supplies. So regional cooperation in the health sector is very important in public health as well as in general health system. And I think cross-border investment, cross-border service delivery by doctors and experts can be thought of. We can do a lot to mitigate the kind of shocks that we all experienced during the COVID situation in the public health domain. Of course, we all have to invest more. It doesn't matter whether we collaborate or not. Particularly Bangladesh situation is very, very bad. We don't even invest 0.7% of GDP, spend 7% of public sector resources in healthcare. So that cannot be a solution for our problem. We have to invest a lot more in public health system to overcome not to have a reputation of similar kind of crisis in any time in future. Critical care has been tested very severely, and we did not perform well in terms of, and in that area also I think we can collaborate between Thailand, Bangladesh, India, and other countries as well. So these are obvious choices that we should try to focus on. Finally, what I would say is that in the case of Bangladesh, of course, we are coming out of the pandemic situation quite nicely, but then we have been experiencing the similar kind of supply shock in the post-pandemic period that the rest of the global economy has experienced in terms of goods and shipping and any type of food products or other raw materials. Everything has gone up so much so that the economies are finding it difficult to adjust, and the inflation is surging. So macroeconomic situation is also being tested in many countries, including Bangladesh and India, I'm sure, because of petroleum price shock before the Ukraine crisis, and now with the Ukraine crisis, the petroleum shock is also going to be a major issue that we BIMSTEC countries have to cope with. If we had more access to power through regional grids and through local generation of power, in case of Bangladesh, we are certainly much more vulnerable because we import almost all our petroleum from abroad. We import a lot of gas from outside now, and we're really vulnerable in terms of the additional payments burden, balance of payment shock, the terms of trade shock that has been in the post-pandemic period that impacted, which has been severely impacted further by this Ukraine-Russia crisis. So we will have a difficult time in the post-pandemic period in terms of macro balances. We also will have to adjust our what you call the import demand quite significantly. Import payment growth, not the volume. The payment growth has already in the pre-Ukraine already increased by 54-55% in Bangladesh for the first 7 months of this fiscal year. It's going to be worse in the remaining months of the fiscal year. And current account deficit is already 10 billion plus in the first 7 months. It can easily go to 20 billion. Never even we have imagined that Bangladesh can have 20 billion. Bangladesh never had 10 billion in the past. So this is going to be a major area that we are vulnerable, and most of us will be vulnerable, as a matter of fact. And we are not prepared for it. BIMSTEC as a group didn't do much on that front, and we should do in future. We have to, as a region, I think we need to be more balanced in terms of food grain. We need to be, which we are in many ways, but still we have some vulnerabilities. Thanks to India, as a surplus country, we can import from there any amount of rice that we probably need, and many other essential products. But on the idea of power, on the basic energy products, Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable, and we need a lot more connectivity in the regional context to overcome shocks of this type in future. The whole region is also vulnerable, as a matter of fact. We did not prepare enough for a shock of this magnitude, and the shock is not only limited to power, and this is also, it's also going to also impact agriculture. Fertilizer import, we're very much dependent on fertilizer import, and fertilizer costs has gone through the roof. Bangladesh government was spending 30,000 crore taka on fertilizer subsidy before pandemic, before the Russian conflict, and Russia being a major supplier of fertilizer, 25% of the global supplies of urea and others comes from Russia. It will create havoc in terms of, I don't know how much would be the subsidy bill for Bangladesh if we pass it on, if we do not pass it on to the farmers. So there are major shocks that we have to absorb in this post-pandemic period, which were all, many of them were unforeseen. We did not expect, we did not prepare for it. And as a matter of fact, global economy did not prepare for it, for this kind of supply shock in the post-pandemic period, and accentuated by the Ukraine crisis. I will stop at this point, and we'll have other discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ehsan, for highlighting so many important issues. And I think one fact that you brought out, which we do not normally discuss in a BIMSTEC setting, and I guess it's appropriate given where we are, is the macroeconomic vulnerability of, I think, every country in the region, which is arising from dependence on imported oil and energy. So I think every country is facing that, and in particular, when we get to Ganesh, I will be wanting to ask him about that for Sri Lanka. But I think that you have highlighted a lot of possibilities where Bangladesh has gained. I think there are also examples for the region on India-Bangladesh cooperation, which others could also learn from. But now I'd like to turn to Sabyasachi Kar and see what he has to say. Give us global perspectives and perspectives from India again, which is also, despite the size of its mammoth foreign reserves, it is still facing a pressure on the external front. I think the market really looks at energy imports as a source of vulnerability, as Ehsan was saying for Bangladesh, even a country like India, with so much of hedging, if you like, in the form of reserves, it is also still facing shock, facing a lot of vulnerability. But Sabyasachi, also given the again, like in South Asia, the preponderance of India in the even in a BIMSTEC setting in terms of GDP and trade and so on, it would be good to hear from you. What is the role that India can play going forward in BIMSTEC? So let me turn over to you, Sabyasachi.
Yeah. Thank you, Sanjay. Can you hear me? I actually lost the link and I've just come back. I hope you can hear me, right? And see me, of course.
Yes, you are very.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start by thanking Sanem and Professor Raihan for organizing this excellent panel and inviting me to this. I am actually, to be frank, I have no expertise in either BIMSTEC or in regional trade. I'm a growth economist and a student of globalization and political economy. So my interests are, and of course, I have an active interest in the Indian economy. So I'm going to speak on this issue from these lenses, touching on some of the issues that Sanjay, you mentioned right at the beginning. So while the topic of this panel focuses on post-COVID period, I really want to take a step back and talk about 2 or 3 things that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years that have really changed the world. And that affects everything, the way through which we look at economics, economic policy, globalization, etc. So the first thing that happened was the global financial crisis, and following that, the kind of political upheaval that we saw in the West, particularly in the US, as a result of which they have turned more protectionist. They have got into some kind of competition with developing countries. They are themselves interested in increasing their own exports. So that's one of the factors, I think, which we need to keep in mind when thinking about everything in the world today. The second one is, of course, the COVID, which actually changed a lot of things in terms of institutions and economic structure. And I'll touch upon some of these as well. And the final thing is, of course, what we are seeing now, a fight between Russia and Ukraine with possibilities of this becoming a larger kind of battle, or the West getting involved in various ways, and especially the way the West has reacted in terms of financial market sanctions, etc. So all of this have implications on what, as developing countries, how we should be thinking about development. And I'll try and share my thoughts on this. So I think the challenges that come up, as a result of all of these global, outcomes that I talked about, I'll talk about 4 challenges, or rather 4 kinds of disruptions that have happened. And all of these disruptions have, in one way or the other, challenged the globalized order that we had for a very long time, post World War II, probably for a very long time. We've been living in that globalized order that has been challenged. So the first 2 are kind of related. The first is the one that has been touched upon by other speakers, which is the outcome of the US-China rivalry. We are living in a world where we are probably moving back from a unipolar world to either bipolar or multipolar kind of world situation. And starting from economic policies to other international relations, everything is getting affected because of this. The second one is, basically the this is partly the outcome of the COVID, which is the way we are looking at supply chains and globalizations have started to change. And the specific thing that I have in mind is that countries are starting to realize that it's not only the efficiency of supply chains, but also their resilience, which is important. And so if supply chains get contained in one single country or a small group of countries, then if you either have a political problem with them or there is some kind of natural shock that affects these countries, then there is a shock on the supply chain globally. And we are seeing a major impact of this in terms of inflation and many other things. The second disruption that I want to touch upon is in fact a positive one, which is and it has been talked about already, is the massive amount of digitalization that we see in the global order. So I'll touch upon two things that have been happening in terms of digitalization. One is in terms of the definition of money itself. We are now, the central banks of countries are now challenged by what is being called private money. You have, various kinds of cryptocurrencies, etc., which has come up, and policymakers all over the world are trying to think of ways in which to accommodate these new changes, but also not let things like monetary policy get out of hand, etc. The second aspect of digitalization that is very critical is actually, the move of the central banks themselves towards digital currencies. We already are aware of the Chinese yuan, the digital yuan, which they have been trying to push for a long time. And just yesterday or 2 days back, the American president, through an ordinance, has explained that they're also going to push for a US digital currency. All of this has implications for the way the financial markets of the world are going to work. We are aware of what is called, dollarization, and the attempt of many countries towards de-dollarization. And the way these digital currencies, etc., will work will, impact ultimately, if not in 5 to 10 years, maybe 20 years, how the international financial markets will look like, whether a particular group of countries, for example, the US and the West, will they have the power to sanction the way they are being able to sanction, Russia, for example. That's another kind of, I would say, disruption that's hit us. And the final disruption has been...
5 minutes more, yeah? Okay,
sure.
Thank you.
And the final disruption that I want to touch upon has been, there for a long time. It is basically the issues of climate change and what that means in terms of how our countries are going to look into the future. We need to have structural transformation, which will make sure that we go towards green technologies, etc. So I've taken a lot of time to talk about things which do not seem to have anything to do with BIMSTEC. So why have I been talking about all of this? I think, all of this background is very important to how we look at regional, understanding regional trade and other regional kinds of collaborations. And there are two potential areas of opportunity that I see. And I think BIMSTEC sits very well in these areas of opportunity to help all the countries involved in all the, the disruptions that I talked about. So the first opportunity is in terms of the supply chain issue that I touched upon. What we increasingly realize is that countries are increasingly going to, or the global order is going to increasingly look for alternatives to a single supply chain or maybe two supply chains in order to increase resilience, in order to make sure that they don't get caught in a certain situation where, because they are dependent on a single supply chain, they are not being able to, their policies are getting restricted, etc. And I think, the first reaction of the West has been in terms of shifting all those supply chains to their own countries. But in my opinion, this is not something that is sustainable in the long run. And that's because ultimately low-cost production happens in developing countries. We know that that's more efficient. But it's possible that the current supply chains may have to, kind of fracture, becoming more smaller supply chains, more regional supply chains. And this is where I think, BIMSTEC has a very good opportunity, because it is already part, for example, countries like Thailand are already part of the supply chain, and they have the know-how. And you have other countries who have, cheaper labor. Bangladesh is doing very well in garments, for example. So there is I see an opportunity where, all of these countries can actually, help each other, be part of a regional supply chain as an alternative maybe to the China-based supply chain that we see today. The second opportunity that I see, again, is in terms of financial markets. And here, I think it is useful to start thinking in the long run in terms of common currencies, but at least in the medium run in terms of a common central bank digital currency. This, of course, is a very difficult process. We have seen that having a common currency is a difficult process. Even in the West, for example, in EU, they have been able to, attain some kind of, institutional arrangement for common currency after a long time. But I think that, as far as these countries in BIMSTEC is concerned, a number of them have some advantages. India, for example, have been a front runner in terms of universal payments. We are our UPI, which is the Universal Payments Interface, has the largest number of transactions in the world. And you have countries like, for example, Thailand, which is already working out, central bank digital currency technologies with Hong Kong, with United Arab Emirates, and with China. And I think there is an obvious case of coming together here, where by taking advantage of this, taking advantage of the disruption in the technological space, we can bring down costs of payments, of investment much lower, and as a result of which I think we can work together towards this kind of a collaboration. I think I'll stop there, and just one more point I think I'll touch upon. The aspect of climate change and the kind of green technologies that we are going to have to invest in. They are expensive. People have talked about resources already, and I think again here we need to have specialization, some kind of value chains in, say, electric vehicles, and that's also another area where we should try to collaborate. I'll stop there, and we're happy to answer any questions on what I've touched upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi, for bringing out some interesting issues and giving us a lot of food for thought. And I think this is the area of supply chain diversification. Now, this has been with us now since President Donald Trump came into power. And it's obviously exacerbated by many things, including the alignment of RCEP as a grouping, which makes the Asia Pacific region even more closely aligned. So I think, but there is much food for thought, and of course, the financial cooperation and digital currencies. There, I think we are not even started thinking very much on those lines. I think first, individual countries have to start thinking about their own currencies if they're going to go into the digital route. And I note that India has declared some kind of an intention to at least start looking at that digital currency issue. But now let me turn to our last speaker before we open up the session. Ganesh Vignaraja, again, an old friend from Sri Lanka. And Ganesh, you are in the hot seat, as it were, because your currency, the Sri Lankan rupee, has been devalued in response to all the pressures that are being, in a sense, all that Ehsan was speaking about has, all those pressures have come to a head for so many reasons in Sri Lanka. But now you have the challenge of setting all of that in a BIMSTEC context as well. So over to you, Ganesh.
Thank you, Sanjay. And it's a great pleasure to see you and to be at this event by SANEM and many other institutions. Thank you, Salim, for the invite. Indeed, I'm going to talk about the macro facing BIMSTEC South Asian members. And I'm going to sort of talk a bit about this Russia-Ukraine crisis based on some research that I've been doing with our former Senior Deputy Central Bank Governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe. And I'm going to sort of talk a bit about this aspect. So I think this is interesting for us when we think of this. And I'm going to talk a bit about the likely economic effects of this Russia-Ukraine crisis on BIMSTEC South Asia and kind of the public policy space that we should be thinking about fairly briefly. The first point is really this COVID point that the panel is supposed to do. And, COVID was this crisis like no other, right? If we remember, there were some 50 million cases in South Asia as of March and some 600,000 deaths, right? And, we have this figure of 48 to 59 million new poor that are created in South Asia. And that's quite staggering. Now, the good news is there was some sort of upturn in 2021 in these countries with a combination of stimulus, favorable external demand, and reasonable vaccination. And you may remember, Sanjay, the forecasts from various institutions were fairly optimistic, right? But there was this two-stage recovery pattern that we were seeing, right? Now, if I take the IMF, I think India was supposed to grow at a staggering 9% in 2022 or expected to, and Bangladesh at 6.5%. Sri Lanka at 3.3, Bangladesh at 4.2, Nepal at 4.4, and so on. Now, the grim reality clearly is that this Ukraine-Russia crisis will have deteriorated the outlook significantly and introduced a lot of downside risks. And my colleague on the panel kind of talked about this. And, we should treat this thing as an external shock and begin to analyze it carefully. There'll be trade channel transmission effects in the first dimension through commodity price hikes, particularly oil, which hit 139 a barrel before kind of coming down a little bit, but continues to be high. We will also have these indirect channels through lower global demand and volatile financial markets. And, inflation anyway was already there in South Asia, right, before coming from global sources. Now, I sort of, in some research which is about to come out, we've been looking at some scenarios. And, the best case scenario of a partial invasion of Ukraine and negotiations for a ceasefire could kind of minimize this conflict shock, right? And the effects of commodity price hikes and the changes in supply chains may be temporary. But even in this sort of worst case scenario, South Asian growth is going to be much lower overall than these kind of IMF projections that we talk about. But this business as usual scenario seems unlikely, right? With Russia seems intent to continue to advance on the major cities and military establishment. So rather than going to the intermediate scenario, the worst case scenario, which is kind of horrifying and really sets our minds, of a full-scale war in Europe, I think we have to contemplate this. And, troops going into Ukraine from Western allies because of NATO being drawn in and prohibiting sanctions on Russia. And this is kind of a chess game, right, with the nuclear factor being thrown into this and prohibiting sanctions, which our colleague also talked about, taking Russia out of the entire SWIFT system, a complete ban on oil and gas from the West. Germany will have difficulty, of course, because of its gas dependence coming through the pipeline rather than the transport route, and it hasn't built the terminal. So there will be some, differentiated between the allies. Now, the economic fallout on BIMSTEC South Asia from this worst will be much more adverse, right, than the combined. I think our estimates are suggesting that it could even be worse than the combined impact of the pandemic, and that's horrifying. And it could also tip the global economy into its second recession in 3 years with differential impacts across South Asia. India, with these large reserves, could be in a better position. But as our Bangladesh colleague talked about, Bangladesh is already under pressure. And therefore, the rest of South Asia in BIMSTEC will also be tipped into contractionary issues. The last point I want to make, for your indulgence, Sanjay, is just talk about responses a little bit to this kind of worst case scenario, which I think could be there. Now, very clearly, economic management in this shock scenario of Ukraine, Russia, and coming out of COVID is going to be difficult. No one said it was going to be easy, but I think we haven't really got a proper handle on shocks, right? Now, to engineer this kind of soft landing or not so bad scenario or less negative contraction, which is what may come, the countries with the fiscal and monetary buffers, and adequate foreign exchange, and that really means India and Bangladesh, right? These are the two should really prepare to implement monetary and fiscal policies to boost domestic demand, right? So that I think is important. India has a special role in all of this. But Nepal and Bhutan, which lack these autonomous monetary policy tools and have currencies that are pegged to the Indian rupee, should use any available fiscal space, the limited amount, right, to support demand. In the worst case, of course, Nepal and Bhutan have to avail of concessionary finance from international financial institutions. Now, Sri Lanka, as you rightly said, is a special case. Sri Lanka, a few days ago, was possibly going to default, but there was some rescheduling of an important loan to India, which have kept the country afloat. And in Sri Lanka's case, we should prioritize really the macro stabilization of the country because it's already depleted its monetary and fiscal policy space to boost domestic demand. And you know, there is this real risk of sovereign default that's coming up unless an external bailout is sought with a strong macro stabilization package. Now, once the sort of macro stabilization is achieved, shall we say, in some measure, preventing the worst contraction, shall we say, in non-India BIMSTEC, but India may also have some significant decline from this 9% projection. South Asia really has to unleash these reforms that I think you've written about, Sanjay, and others, and so let the private sector really fulfill an important role in markets, but also this green transition, right? That opportunity that our colleague from the RBI chair just talked about. And in the BIMSTEC constants, I think we really have to now, you know, trade channel has not advanced much, right? We're talking about trade facilitation, of course, but we should explore ways really of strengthening regional monetary and financial cooperation. And perhaps, you know, some baby steps like appointing an expert group to look at this should be a start with a view to sort of thinking about, you know, monetary cooperation, maybe a Chiang Mai initiative of some kind in the extreme case. But we need to think about this very seriously, linked to the IMF, of course. So in summary, I think this Ukraine-Russia crisis will be much more severe than what we think, and will derail this, even this two-speed recovery potentially. And you know, as a next importer of commodities, South Asian BIMSTEC countries are very vulnerable to soaring prices of commodities, rising inflation, which was already there, lower external demand, supply chain disruptions, increasing poverty. That 48 to 59 million I talked about could be eclipsed. The number could even be 75 to 100 million. And that's horrifying, right? That's a country the size of Bangladesh in poor. Horrifying, you know, potentially in the worst case scenario. So we need a mix of macro stabilization, reforms, regional monetary cooperation, and reforms to bring some sort of semblance of order. I'm sorry to sound so bleak, but I think one should bring in this to this sort of very important dialogue on post-COVID. Thank you, Sanjay. I hope I haven't taken too much time.
No, that was very good, Ganesh, very clear. And in a sense that you have highlighted you know, in a sense, you have kind of jumped into the fire. And the first time I have heard anybody trying to start quantifying the impact of, or even talk about it, the growth impact of the new crisis that, you know, that we are all in, the Russian provoked crisis. And you know, you're saying that we could be possibly headed for even a third recession. I think that is very sobering to us. And what are the ways out of it as for individual countries? At the end of the day, countries have to manage their own economies, but also as a grouping, as a regional grouping. What are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about? So this is food for thought, and I think the presentations have all been very complementary to each other. So I think it gives participants a lot of food for thought. And so I'm going to now open up the floor. And I noticed, so I'm going to first give, so those who have asked questions in the chat box, I would request you to put up your hand. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to actually state your questions on the floor itself rather than through the chat box. So let me start with Sumit Nakandala, who I see his hand raised. So Sumit, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjay. It was a very enriching session. I've heard a number of submissions, starting from your opening statement to Rupa, and then Mr. Mansoor, and then finally our own Ganesh. Now, my question is, my submission to Ganesh is, it was very interesting. I think it is very important to have this monetary cooperation, which Ganesh, at the latter part of his explanation, try to explain. Because I think he would remember that we had swap agreement with Bangladesh and then India in past few months. Now, within it is very important also to see that within BIMSTEC, while we are even discussing midway about the FTAs and then other instruments of regional economic integration, separately, I suppose whether there is a possibility of discussing the monetary integration. Of course, I am mindful that Sri Lankan rupee is not convertible, and I don't think other currencies in BIMSTEC member states are convertible. But this is important in the context of projections. If there is economic crisis or meltdown within the region, I think it's a very plausible and laudable suggestion to have a monetary cooperation among the 7 member states to help each other in the event of a financial crisis. Just a thought, Sanjay. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit. Let me take 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll come back to the panelists. So, Probir, you had a question. Do you want to ask that? Probir Day.
Sanjay, I have written it in the chat box. So
yes, go ahead and say, speak it out.
It is to question to Dr. Rupa Chanda. I mean, everyone talks about issues which are non-FTA. So it's curious to know that, without FTA, I'd ask the questions to Dr. Rupa that what would be justified? That should we go for an FTA or no FTA required? If you'd like to encourage a trade, remember that in BIMSTEC region, Nepal and Bhutan, 96% of global trade they do with the BIMSTEC. Nepal, almost about 70% of the global trade that they do with BIMSTEC, and that's also increased in last 2 decades. So is FTA is very much important, or we leave aside FTA and go ahead with others? Thank you.
Thank you, Probir. Okay, so let me turn to the panelists. So there's the macro question that Sumit posed, and I would first turn to Ehsan and then back to Ganesh on that one, and then even if Sabyasachi has any thoughts. But Ehsan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Could you be more specific about the question itself again, please?
I think Sumit was talking about the possibilities of some kind of macro financial cooperation
Okay.
within the BIMSTEC region.
Yes. Let me be very honest on that, because we can of course go for what you call foreign exchange swap facilities. That's done among many countries, and we can certainly do it. There is not much of a problem there. Particularly India, Bangladesh can easily do it. Nepal can also do it. Sri Lanka has become a bit of a problematic nowadays. But in future, once they stabilize their economy, they can also be part of the regional foreign exchange swap facilities so that we can support each other in times of needs. And since Bangladesh and India has good amount of reserves, we both can provide comfort to each other, and it's easy part of it. Beyond that, monetary cooperation is very unlikely, because unless monetary cooperation will require much more integration of the economies to really go into any kind of monetary cooperation, and we're not anywhere there. Free trade agreement is an essential first step for any future further integration in investment and monetary integration and those types of things. So, but we are still only negotiating. A proposal came from India for a free trade agreement with Bangladesh to initiate discussions. Very recently, I saw it in the media. I think we should both take it seriously. We should see whether we can conclude a free trade agreement with some safeguards for Bangladesh, at least in terms of timing, in terms of certain industries and so on, so that our industry feels more comfortable in doing the much bigger economy like India, much more competitive power, much more strength. But I personally think if you can conclude something with some safeguards there, it should be a very good step forward for our regional integration, as well as eventual cooperation on investment front, on monetary front, and in many other areas. So,
yeah. Thank you very much, Ehsan. Ganesh, do you have any additional thoughts, or you're okay with this?
Yes, just to say, I think, this crisis that we had with COVID and now Ukraine really underlines for me the need for monetary cooperation. Okay, so I think we've got to do this. Now, the way to start this, I think, is to really have a study, hopefully sanctioned by either the ministers' process or the summit, of experts to kind of study the architecture, right, and to look at East Asian and other models that are there. So I think an expert group is the first thing, and maybe ESCAP might convene such a group. ESCAP has a very good mechanism to do this in the region, or under BIMSTEC umbrella, it can be there. The second step, I think, is to try to have, like in the SARC process, a BIMSTEC central bank governors process, which I think would be very useful. Yeah. So at least the governors talk and meet about some of these important issues. Now, the swap arrangement, in the SARC case, as you may know, there is a SARC swap process that goes on, right? So there are bilateral, but there's also a SARC swap. I think in a similar manner, in the first instance, say Bangladesh or India were to give Sri Lanka additional swaps, shall we say, under a BIMSTEC process to be done in the future, maybe one round can be there. But in the second round, just like in the SARC swap process, it should be linked to the country going to an IMF program, be it Sri Lanka or Bhutan or Nepal or anybody else. And I think that's very important, because what we learned from even the Chiang Mai initiative, Sanjay, which you know, of course, is that, the fund is the big gun in all of this, right? In the regional context, we may not have enough ammunition, shall we say, to really deal with the big balance of payments crisis. The last point I simply want to make is, these are kind of preventative measures, right? And with that, we need a surveillance process, okay? And that's where the central bank governors come into play. So I think there are some important steps we can do if we really want to deal with BIMSTEC in a meaningful manner, if we're not talking about trade. I'll stop there and maybe come back to trade later. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much. So let me, given that there are several questions popping up, Sabyasachi, I'll give you a chance, if there are other questions, you can also wrap in any thoughts on this in that. Let me go to Uday Bhanu Singh. Why don't you ask your question?
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Ehsan and any other panelists who may wish to answer. What will be the impact of the rise of China-Myanmar economic corridor and the decline of the BCIM, in the light of the changes in Myanmar, in the light of the COVID challenge, and the latest, the Ukraine crisis? What will be the impact of the rise of the China-Myanmar economic crisis, the economic corridor?
Thank you.
Okay, Ehsan, direct question to you.
Yes. Now, I'm not a geopolitical expert, but what appears to me is that the current situation in Myanmar is not also very conducive for China to go for a real big-time investment with the whole population not in favor of the government. So it is a situation which is, frankly speaking, which is not good for any of the countries, not for Bangladesh, not for Myanmar, not for Thailand, or not for India. So we need to somehow, there has to be a resolution of the Myanmar's own problem. Then also this Rohingya issue. This issue is also there. And this corridor is something that will not be very safe corridor if this political issue, which has a conflict associated with that, is resolved satisfactorily for all the ethnic groups plus the majority of the Burmese and the government of Burma, Myanmar. So this I don't think that a lot can happen under the current military regime, and the initial plan of China to really focus on that and bypass all other initiatives is not really going to materialize very significantly. Of course, military government would like to do it, but it will face security challenges in the process, and that's not good for it. I mean, Chinese initiatives also face problem in Pakistan, security challenges in certain provinces of Balochistan and part of Sindh. So it's not easy to ignore the local resistance and go for a multinational initiative or regional initiative which bypasses the local population. It's the security of that kind of corridor. Ensuring that will be a major challenge. And so it cannot be taken.
Indeed, Ehsan, thank you. And in fact, I note that the same issue obviously applies to Afghanistan as well now, even more than earlier, because of the situation there as well. So yeah, we have quite a few crisis countries in our sub-region or broader region. Let me turn. Anybody else who wants to ask questions, please raise your hand in the chat box. Let me turn to Nihal. Nihal, I see your hand up.
Sorry, actually, it's not a question. I was sort of wondering that the crisis between the war in Ukraine and Russia, the effects are actually multiple than I think we alluded to. It's not only the trade, energy dependence, and it's also the price effects. I mean, you have the direct exposure, basically. It might not damage some of the exports, it might damage some of the imports channels, and especially the supply chain channels, which is already precarious at the moment. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is for South Asian economies is that it pushes up the inflation and it undermines the purchasing power of the households, right? The conflict as it is that it happens. Given that the inflation backdrop is already precarious, the additional shock to the price levels comes very unfortunate, actually. The wheat price especially would have, in effect, in terms of that price of grain substitutes such as rice, and the corn prices will push up, right? So especially on the rice prices on rice would have an impact. The high energy price could also have impact on fertilizer and stuff like that. So it's going to impact South Asian economies quite a bit than I think we have discussed about. Just a quick statement. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nihal. Let me turn to Rupa. I'm sorry, I neglected to ask you. Can you please address the question from Probir?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask because we've been talking about a free trade area, but it's not happened. I think, let's be realistic. I don't see it happening in the near future, but I agree with you that if you really want to deepen integration, then you need to have something more concrete. The problem you've also highlighted, because there's too much asymmetry. Some countries are much, much more dependent on the other BIMSTEC members, while others have many extra regional, outside the BIMSTEC, India, for instance, Thailand, for instance. So they don't really require some of the smaller countries as part of their trade basket as much. So this asymmetry makes it more difficult to frame a trade agreement, free trade agreement. What I would say is that whether or not you have a free trade agreement, what's far more important in my view to even start off with is to have something, some agreement on cross-border connectivity, regional transport connectivity. Like, for instance, I know there's a draft agreement on that. Something on trade facilitation. I think first you have to have something concrete in those areas, which I say again have to underpin anything you do with a free trade agreement. You can have a free trade agreement and not have connectivity, not have trade facilitation, then where is it going to take you? So the other thing I feel increasingly is that, we talk as if governments drive everything. Yes, political will is very important, but B2B is something we need to focus on perhaps more, because if the private sector's incentives are there to trade in the region, to invest in the region, to develop the value chain linkages, if they see the opportunities, then there will be that push. So can we bring together the private sector much more to see where these opportunities might lie? And I think what Ganesh Vignaraja was saying, we really need to do much more detailed studies, understanding where these opportunities in terms of regional value linkages and who is placed where, what are the comparative advantages, what are the potential products. This kind of understanding is required, because unless there is a motive for the private sector, ultimately firms trade. It is not countries and governments that are trading. So if there isn't that motive at the private sector level, it will never materialize. So we need to find that and create platforms for more of private sector engagement. So my long answer to your thing is that yes, we ultimately need to move towards one, but to be realistic, I don't see one coming. We need to still push hard for something on transport connectivity and trade facilitation and get some concrete results there. And we need to create more scope for dialogue between the private sector associations, bodies, and so on in these countries, and support it with also academic studies to inform where these value chain linkages and opportunities will lie. Meanwhile, I would go with what someone else has also said. Use smaller steps, incremental steps, some of the areas, whether it's environmental sustainability or you're looking at health sector cooperation, because these will also create opportunities for the private sector. Health sector, I think, has a lot of scope in terms of just cross-border investment in facilities. It's already there in diagnostics. Maybe some countries will play more of a role than others, like India will probably play more of a role. IT sector. So I think we need to think of these spaces where there are already opportunities, there are lead players within the region, and there is a private sector incentive to engage more in the region. Maybe those will create that push for eventually something like a free trade agreement, because I don't see the political will right there at this time.
Thank you, Rupa. I think that is a realistic assessment of the situation on an FTA, and I very much agree with your broader point. There is a question from Mehboob Alam. He has not raised his hand, but let me read the question that he's raised, and he's asking. And I think Ganesh has kind of already got to some of the elements of the answer, but he's saying that you've got the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, coming on top of the COVID-19. What will be the impact of this on BIMSTEC countries? Now, Ganesh has already addressed this in many ways. So, Sabyasachi, let me turn to you if you have any additional thoughts in a kind of geopolitical context on this question, and then if you also want to any further thoughts on the macro financial cooperation question.
Right. I think I'll first touch upon the second one, which my co-panelists were also interested in, which is the issue of this monetary / financial collaboration. I think monetary collaboration is a very distant target. I mean, we've seen the European Union, for example, try monetary collaboration, and we've seen the pitfalls of that. It seems that having a monetary collaboration without having fiscal collaboration leads to all kinds of problems. We've seen how Greece almost was on the verge of leaving the European Union because of the kind of divergences that they had with EU. I think it's much more practical to think in terms of simply payments collaboration, and payments is much simpler than monetary collaboration. I think a lot of all kinds of international flows, including trade, but also foreign investments, can be incentivized. The costs of cross-border payments can be brought down between these countries. Cost not only in terms of money cost, but also in terms of time. As we all know, that trade is very sensitive to time, and this makes a huge difference. So as a medium-term kind of target, I think it's possible to have some kind of clearing houses which can act as a kind of monetary or rather payments clearing organization between these countries, much on the lines of what we have in other situations as well. There are other examples of these things happening. So that is, I think, a much more practical objective, and it will definitely have positive outcomes which we can fall back on. So that's what I really wanted to say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sabyasachi. Ganesh, any additional thoughts on the question raised?
So I think the shock element is really in terms of this 9% prediction for India, right? Are we really are we in the territory of 4-5% for India this year, right? Because the shock will revibrate with second round effects in year 2. Okay, so that's India, half the growth forecast cut. Sri Lanka, are we going towards 1% if we're lucky? I don't know. Bangladesh, the numbers may come down quite a bit from the 4, 5, or 6.5% they were talking about. So that's the kind of quantitative impact we may expect, right? It depends on the scenarios, it depends on the linkages, as you know, and the second and third round effects, right? On the cooperation point, you're Sabyasachi, absolutely right. I mean, fiscal cooperation a la European Union style, didn't work very well. I'm talking about some sort of safety nets. You see, the challenge, Sabyasachi, is in the BIMSTEC thing is you've got Thailand and India as large economies, and you've got the smaller ones, right? So you have a different situation to what you have in South, the asymmetrical problem, right? So I think if we want to make BIMSTEC work, we have to deal with this asymmetry issue. We've been tiptoeing around it, okay? And for the smaller countries in particular, and in Sri Lanka, which is now in difficulty, and sadly I'm here, or the country is sadly in difficulty, you realize that we need, if we're really talking about regional cooperation, we really need to be talking about what matters, right? So that's monetary cooperation in some form with an IMF program attached to that, right? So the fiscal part will come, I think, if an IMF program comes to be as a second round effect. And also this pandemic health type cooperation, which I think Rupa and others also have talked about. Otherwise, what's in it for the small countries? For the large countries, when you take it in the ultimate look, they have, and I don't believe in absolute advantage in industry, none of us do, I don't think, but the risks there are high, right? So if we can at least provide these safety nets at the regional level, then that acts as a big incentive. So hence the monetary point, and I think we need to calibrate that with this expert group looking at all these issues very carefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ganesh. Since there are no more questions, I know it's been a long day for everybody, and it's evening, getting to be late evening in the region. Let me give 1 minute each to the 3 panelists before I kind of wrap up the session. So let me begin in the reverse order of how recently people have spoken. So let me start with Ehsan. Do you have any final thoughts, 1 minute thoughts?
Thank you. No, I just wanted to re-emphasize that we could do more. We certainly can do more, and in many areas. As I said before, the areas we should focus on is the health, education, trade, of course, investment, power. Those are good areas which can then take us to the next step, which will be more integrated in terms of trade, free trade kind of things down the line. It's not going to happen overnight. There will be discussions. It may take another 10 years before we can conclude a free trade agreement with India, in my view. And finally, I would say monetary integration, is far off, because free trade is the first essential step towards that. Then the fiscal integration, then the monetary integration. So there's a long way. In the meantime, only swap arrangements can be helpful. Yes, consultation between the finance ministers and the governors of central banks will be helpful in pushing the agenda, broader agenda forward. That's we can look for. Have a forum, annual forum of finance ministers and governors to meet and carry forward the agenda forward. But that's the only way. I'd say incrementally we can go there.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Sabyasachi, final 1 minute thoughts.
Right. So I think, if we look at the bigger picture, I think South Asia has got used to missing the bus too often in terms of thinking about how we need to, think about, policies and think about initiatives. I think we are right now at a very important cusp in the history of economics, I would say, where the thinking about many issues are changing very fast. You take monetary policy, you take fiscal policy, many of them are changing. I think we have to take advantage of some of these changes. I think these changes are actually beneficial to us. I would say that the earlier thinking was in many ways constraining us as developing countries to use some of these policies. And I think now with thinking opening up, we can think out of the box and try to make up for the buses that we have missed in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabyasachi. Rupa, final thoughts?
Yeah, so I would just basically say I agree that there is a lot of scope within this region, but realistically, nothing is going to be achieved very soon. I would suggest strongly that we look at the low-hanging fruits. Perhaps we've been doing that too long, but look at those areas where really it would make an impact on development. And that's why I completely agree that sectors such as health or education, or even bringing in digital inclusion, digital integration, MSMEs, these are the kinds of things that perhaps would also bring in goodwill and try to involve the private sector far, far more than perhaps we have done so far. I'm witnessing the difference, just sitting in ESCAP, between the dynamism that we see in the ASEAN region in terms of, and that's helped by the fact that you don't have one very hegemonic sort of player. I think the asymmetries really make it much more challenging in BIMSTEC, but I think let's start with more social and developmental sort of objectives and then bring in the private sector and move eventually towards a trade agreement. I also think that monetary or financial cooperation requires far, far deeper integration and political will. So that's really far away. But the idea of a cross-border sort of facilitation of payments and settlements and so on would be very, very helpful for facilitating trade.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rupa. Thank you. Ganesh, final thoughts, please.
Thank you. So just picking up from what Rupa was saying, the lesson for me after having spent, 15 years working in East Asia and mostly on East Asia was really that, it's the smaller countries that led the regional process. Okay, it wasn't the larger ones, right? So China, Japan, Korea sort of took a back seat. Not quite true, but sort of took a back seat, and ASEAN did it. And ASEAN was a coherent group. So I think we have to think a little bit about that dynamic of this. Okay. The second point is I completely agree with Rupa that we should go for the low-hanging fruit, and some of these issues like health, climate, existential issues become very important. The monetary one is becoming existential, Rupa, and I think we have to think carefully of the regional link to the global, right? So hence the regional swap arrangement linked to the IMF. Yeah. So I think we need to think a bit like that. The last point I just want to briefly make, Sanjay, is that I think we really have to look at the BIMSTEC Secretariat and its function. I mean, I noticed that my dear friend Sumit Nakandra was talking about the 7 directors and so on. But remember, ASEAN has 100 professionals, if I've got that right. I can't remember what SCAP size is. Is it 200? I can't remember. But you need something like that to really, with some devolution of sovereignty, okay, to getting some of these things done. You can't have BIMSTEC as a post office if you want. Forgive me for saying this.
Okay, thank you very much, Ganesh. Let me now, this very rich and very interesting and thoughtful session from, and where all the 4 panelists, I think, contributed very interesting insights. A few final thoughts as I kind of try to wrap up this, and not summarizing, but kind of providing a little bit of perspective. We know that Asia is traditionally known to be fast growing. So this is a combination of East Asia and South Asia, right? This BIMSTEC grouping, it's very fast growing, pre-COVID, and I dare say it will come back post-COVID to a galloping pace. And the intra-regional trade, notwithstanding the lack of a free trade agreement, in fact, indeed, that, as Rupa has noted, it's not even necessary, but intra-regional trade has almost doubled over the last decade, over the last 2 decades in this grouping. So there is a lot of a gravity. The forces of natural gravity are, impelling the region to trade more with each other. For the largest country in the region, India, it is the least contentious of all the groupings that it participates in. So there is a natural political reason why India kind of supports that. And I think that's something, alluding to the last remark of Ganesh, is what is it that the smaller countries, how can they use that interest that India has in BIMSTEC? How can the other countries leverage that interest, right? Mm-hmm. Because ultimately they are the ones who are going to gain much more than a large giant country has. So I think that's a critical point. How can the smaller countries drive this process? And it also makes it politically more acceptable for everybody, right? So I think from a political economy point of view, that is a very important issue that I think it would be well, I think, for the rest of the deliberations to keep that in mind. Every country has a lot to gain from BIMSTEC, and we know that. So I won't go into the details of that, but and even India does for sure. But I want to highlight a few thoughts. There's the macro issue came up again and again, the macro cooperation, and the fact that all countries are vulnerable today from the oil shock. We traditionally, starting from the 70s when we faced the first oil shock, we've known that South Asian countries and this grouping have been very, very vulnerable. So can they at least have some kind of a formal arrangement in at least the currency, the swap arrangements, which, as Ganesh noted, are already there in the SARC process? Can we kind of formalize it in a BIMSTEC process? I don't think there are any issues there. I think a kind of regional safety net, at least it could be. I would classify it as one of the lower hanging fruits that Rupa and Sabyasachi have also referred to. So having some kind of a regional safety net, but as all a further deepening of that obviously requires a lot more, as all our friends have pointed out. Another low-hanging fruit, and action on this is already happening, and everybody's talked about this, starting with Ehsan, is energy, right? So there is a lot of bilateral stuff going on in energy in this eastern side of the region, especially between India, Bhutan, India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, right? And there are some very encouraging moves even on the trilateral front on this, which makes it, again, from a political economy perspective, the trilateral aspect makes it more acceptable to the smaller countries. So I think that's important to note, because I think at the end, now everything has become cast in politics, geopolitics. So we need to be mindful of that. The big issue that came from the Trumpian era, the China trade war, and continuation under President Biden, and then of course the supply chain, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, this is, many people are saying, obviously it's very early days, but people are saying it could shape the global economic order. I don't know whether we will get there. Everybody has different takes on that. But certainly one issue that will remain with us, as everybody has pointed, especially Sabyasachi, is the issue of supply chain resilience and diversification, right? So I think there are possibilities here for the region in terms of nearshoring. I agree that reshoring is really not going to go very far, especially because it negates the whole idea of resilience through diversification. But I think shorter supply chains gives a possibility to the rise of nearshoring. And there, I think, again, as Rupa has pointed out, reducing barriers, right, even in the absence of an FTA, reducing barriers through trade facilitation, as has already happened, will be very important. And there, I think the green supply chains, which I think Sabyasachi talked about, the green supply chains will be very important. And I think there's a lot there that can be happened there. Digital trade is itself a form of a greening supply chains, right? You're delivering services remotely, but there are so many other. Solar energy exchange is again a green supply chain. Pharma, it's a service. So I think most services would come under that category. Right? So and I think the private sector, as Rupa said, bringing in the private sector and creating incentives for the private sector to cooperate. I think this is the importance of that. And I think when the summit takes place, for leaders to really deliberate on that, even as they're doing their thing that leaders do, but really looking at what are the incentives. Are you creating some form of incentives for the private sector to trade with each other? So I will end with the point, which I think the critical point about the political economy of the region. And, as India's geopolitical interest is strong in BIMSTEC as a formation, even if it does not get to a free trade agreement, and how can the smaller countries really leverage that to really push on something which I think for the last 2 decades has really remained a potential arrangement. And Sumit, I am noting you in that as well, and I hope that we can make further deepen some aspects of this, at least the low-hanging part. So Salim, thank you again, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, and thank you all the panelists. I think it was an excellent session, and it actually went beyond my expectation, I must admit. The reason I'm saying, because when the summit was kind of decided that the summit would take place, I think nobody in this region could think about this Ukraine-Russia war, a new added crisis, to the COVID crisis. And also for us, when we thought of having this second Bay of Bengal economic dialogue, we also didn't have in our mind that, we'll discuss on this Ukraine-Russia crisis. We are very much focusing on post-COVID kind of, how the economies would recover and what are the challenges. Now, I think our syllabus has expanded and we have to address this. And I'm really glad that the panelists, they have addressed these questions quite, significantly, and very, very, I think, very interesting discussion. We have 3 more interesting sessions tomorrow, and I welcome you all to attend. And again, with this, I thank you all once again. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim.
Thank you.
Sanjay, thank you very much, Rupa. Ganesh, I think you also provided very good but I will hold that view on the monetary cooperation, even for a temporary period, because that's our survival at the moment.
Thank you. Good luck to you in Sri Lanka, and I really hope you come out of the woods very soon.
I would say inshallah.
All right.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Okay. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.